Today we're going to create a React registration form with custom validation for a username, a password, and a password confirmation field. One key feature that sets this tutorial apart is how we will consider accessibility throughout the creation of the registration form. Let's get started. Hello and welcome. Hi, I'm Dave. Let's create a React registration form with custom validation and accessibility features. I've got Visual Studio Code open here on the left and an example of the registration form that we're going to create running in Chrome on the right. Now this tutorial is more intermediate level than it is beginner. Ideally, you will have already completed my React for Beginners course or a similar course for getting started with React. Now I'm not going to explain all the basics of the React hooks I use or go into detail about the basic setup. We'll just keep moving, and I'll make sure to share a link to the source code in the description too. And if you like the style and pace of this video, make sure to like the video and comment below so I'll know to make more like it. Okay, in Visual Studio Code, I've already cleared out all of the unnecessary files that we usually see over here in the file tree when you create a React app. And this is the index.js, no surprises here, very minimal. And then when we look at the package JSON, you can see I've even uninstalled any dependencies that we won't be using. So I've just got React, React DOM, and React scripts at this time. We can add in some more as well. And then when we look at the app.js, you can see I've already created a register component, and I'm importing that. And that's what we're putting here in the JSX. Also, I have changed the default div to a main element. I prefer semantic HTML elements, still left the class name app, and that's all of the changes to the app file. So really we're creating a self-contained component today, and that is going to be in our register.js. So let's start by importing the hooks we're going to use. So I'll type import and use ref and press tab, and from there it completes the import statement, but we can add a couple of more hooks here. So not just use ref, we're going to use state and useEffect. Notice how my code is wrapping lines here. If that's not doing it for you and going off the screen instead, you can press Alt-Z to get Visual Studio Code to wrap those lines for you. Okay, now that we've imported the three hooks that we're going to use, let's also add some other imports from Font Awesome, but first we'll need to install that Font Awesome dependency. So if we go to Chrome, I'm going to open up the Font Awesome page talking about React, and Font Awesome will provide SVGs as React components when we install Font Awesome correctly here with npm. So we can look at the three dependencies we need. They're showing npm I or npm install. You can just use I, it means the same thing. They're also showing -- save, which you shouldn't need if you have a current version of npm and node. And then you've got the three different dependencies listed right here. We can actually do all three of those in one line. So let's go back to Visual Studio Code and do that. Of course, I'll put a link to that page in the description of this video. So in Visual Studio Code, I'm going to just expand the window. I'm going to open a new terminal with Control and the backtick. You can also do that from the terminal menu and choose New Terminal. Once you do that, I'm just going to paste in those dependencies. It looks like I missed the N when I copied, so I need to go to the beginning of my line here. But notice all three dependencies are in the same line, and it should start with npm I. Once you have all of that entered, you should just be able to press enter and install these dependencies, and when they finish installing, I'll come back to the tutorial and continue. Okay, Font Awesome has finished installing. I'll close the terminal window. Let's quickly look at the package JSON, and we can see those three dependencies added here in our package JSON, so we've confirmed that we've installed those correctly. And now with the new import statement, I'll type import, and I'm going to type FA, and then with a capital C check, and press tab, and it completes that import. Now I want two other icons as well. So I also want FA times and FA info circle. There we go, got all three. Now we also need to import the Font Awesome icon component. So here we'll type Font Awesome icon and press tab, and it will complete that import as well. Now we've got all we need from Font Awesome. Okay, I'm going to give an extra line here and paste in two regex statements here. So we've got a user regex that we're going to validate the username with, and a password regex that we're going to validate the password with. The user regex says it must start with a lower or uppercase letter. After that, it must be followed by anywhere from 3 to 23 characters that can be lower or uppercase letters, digits, hyphens, or underscores, and any of that will work. So overall, it must be 4 to 24 characters. Now the password regex requires at least one lowercase letter, one uppercase letter, one digit, and one special character, and it can be anywhere from 8 to 24 characters. So that's what we will be validating the user input with in those fields. Now we're ready to go ahead and create our component. I'm going to press Control Alt and the letter R. You might try typing this directly into your file as well and do underscore RAFCE. Press enter and we get a React functional component. Now I've got ES7 React snippets installed to do this. It's an extension that you can search for over here under extensions. I'll also provide a link to that in the description. Now that we've got our functional component, which if you don't have that extension you may have to type out, we can go ahead and start adding some information there. So I'm going to scroll up and give us some room where we can put in some state and other hooks in our component. I'm going to start by putting in 2 useRef references. We're going to do one for the user input, and that will allow us to set the focus on the user input when the component loads. We're going to have another one for an error reference, and that is because if we get an error, we need to put the focus on that so it can be announced by a screen reader for accessibility. Now I'm going to paste in the state for the user field, and we can discuss that. So here is our user state, and this will be tied to the user input. So we have user and set user. We've also got valid name and set valid name, and that's a Boolean. That is tied to whether the name validates or not. And finally, we've got user focus and set user focus, and this is also a Boolean, and it will be whether we have focus on that input field or not. And now that you know what those 3 are for, I'll go ahead and paste in the state for the other 2 fields, and you can see that's really exactly the same. And we have the state for the same 3 purposes for the password and the matching password fields. And finally, we're going to add some state for a possible error message if an error exists, and also success if we successfully submit the registration form or not. Let's scroll up once again for some more room, and underneath our state we're going to apply the useEffect hook. The first time we apply it, it's going to be for setting the focus when the component loads. Notice there's nothing in the dependency array, so this will only happen when the component loads, and we'll set the focus on that username input. And of course, to do so, we'll have to reference that user ref on that input. The next useEffect is going to be applied to the username, and this is where we validate the username. So notice now the user state is in the dependency array. So anytime it changes, it will check the validation of that field. I'm defining it with result so I can log result to the console and show whether we've got true or false and what the user state is. You could actually just put this much, the user regex test, where you're testing the user state against the regex that we created, and put it right here inside the set valid name. And you could do all of this in one line if we didn't need that result to log to the console. I'm going to scroll up again for a little more room, and now I'll paste in the useEffect for the password. Notice it's a little different, although it starts out the same. We once again have result. We're testing against the password regex and the password state now, and we have the password state in the dependency array. And we're also logging those just to see what we get there and when it's valid and when it's not. But now the confirmation is defined with match, and we're comparing password to the match password state, which will also return a Boolean, and we're setting whether we have a valid match or not. The nice thing about having both of these inside the same useEffect is that anytime one of them changes, the valid match will also check, whether we change that field or the password field. And that allows it to be in sync with the password field at all times. So you've got password and match password in the dependency array, and both of these are set within the same useEffect. And finally, we're going to set one more useEffect, and it is for the error message. And if we display an error message, of course we want it to be available, but then anytime the user changes the information, changes the state of one of these 3 state pieces here inside of the dependency array, then we will go ahead and clear out the error message because the user has read that error message and now they are adjusting by making changes. Okay, let's scroll up and we're ready to work on the JSX now, and the first thing we'll do is switch this div to a section element. Once again, using a more semantic element than div. I'm going to save as well. Now nothing will change on our page, and once again we're looking at an example app over here. We haven't actually added any JSX to the register form we're currently creating, but this is our goal of what it will look like. I'm not going over the CSS. You could style it your own way, or you could look at my CSS that will be available in the source file. I will describe some of the classes though. So now that we've got our section for the JSX, I'm going to tab in and paste in what will hold an error if an error exists. So let's look at what this is. It's a paragraph, and it will be displayed at the top of the form. Here we've got our error ref created with useRef, and now we've got a class name. So if the error message exists, this is the error message state. Then we use a ternary statement and we apply the class error message, which will display the error message. Otherwise, we apply the class off screen, which will take this whole paragraph positioned absolutely way off the screen, but it will still be available to screen readers instead of display none, which would remove it from the document. Now this ARIA live attribute is set to assertive, and that means when we set the focus on this element that has the ref of error ref, it will be announced with the screen reader, and that is important if an error exists. And then here we simply display the error message, which is the error message state. Let's follow this error message paragraph with an H1 that will give the title for our form, and that is simply register. And now let's create the form after that. It will not have an action attribute though, so we can remove that. And now we'll put our inputs inside the form. Each input should have a label element. So let's go ahead and provide the label. And notice each label will have an HTML4 attribute that needs to match the ID of the input. This will be the username value, and that's the ID we will give the username input. So here for the label, then we can just say username. Now I'm going to scroll up and paste the input underneath and describe each attribute because it has several. I'll save to get better formatting. And the first attribute is type text, which we absolutely need. The next is ID, and that's the ID of username, which should match the HTML4 attribute on the label. The next attribute is the ref that we created with useRef, which will allow us to set focus on the input. The next attribute is autocomplete, which we want to set to off because we don't want to see previous values suggested for this field that others may have entered. This is a registration field. It should be a new username, so those suggestions would not help. The onChange here, this function will provide the event and then we'll set the user state. So this ties the input to the user state. This input is also required. And now two important attributes for accessibility. Here we have ARIA invalid, which will be set to true when the component loads because we will not have a valid name. Notice this is a ternary statement. So if we do have a valid username that has passed our validation, this will be set to false. This lets a screen reader announce whether this input field needs adjusted before the form is submitted. So that definitely helps accessibility. The next one is ARIA described by. And notice these ARIA attributes still have hyphens. They do not use camel case like the other attributes like autocomplete, for example. And this is fine in React. ARIA attributes still use this hyphenated structure. With ARIA described by, this actually lets us provide another element that describes the input field. So a screen reader will read the label first. It will read what type of input the label is addressing. Then it will also read the ARIA invalid, whether it has valid input or not. And then it will jump to the ARIA described by element to give a full description. And this is where we can put in the requirements that our registration form needs and have a screen reader read those. With onFocus, we're simply setting if the user input field has focus, we're setting that to true. And then onBlur, of course, that's when you leave the user input field, we're setting the focus to false. So now let's scroll up for some more room again. But we see our ARIA described by references an element with the ID of user ID note, UID note. So I will paste that in, and it's a paragraph. Save again for better formatting. And here's our paragraph with the ID, UID note, and once again, a class name. So we're saying if user focus is true, and if the user state exists. In other words, if it's not empty. If we have an empty field, we don't want to display these instructions immediately when the form loads. We want to wait until at least one character is typed. And then if there is not a valid name, if there's a valid name, of course, we'll go ahead and hide the instructions as well. But if we meet all of these requirements, the instructions are shown. And otherwise, this is also set to off screen. It is not set to display none, but it is taken off the screen with an absolute position in the CSS, and that still allows these directions to be available to screen readers. Notice I'm also pulling in one of the Font Awesome icons, and this is a Font Awesome icon component, and we just specifically say which icon to use then. And we'll see how that shows up in the form as well. Okay, now that we've introduced the Font Awesome icons, we can finish the last little bit of our input for the username. So once again, in the label, right after we have username, I'm going to paste in a couple of spans that have Font Awesome icons in them. And the class name has a ternary for each. It's simple for the check, which would be the green check mark. So if we have a valid username, we're going to apply the class valid. Otherwise, we're going to go ahead and hide this icon. Now the hide will set the display to none, and that's okay because this is essentially visually for us if we're not using a screen reader. If we're using a screen reader, that's what the ARIA invalid attribute was for. So this is just giving us a visual cue that is very similar to the ARIA invalid attribute. Now, for the red X, it's a little more complicated than just checking if we have a valid name. Certainly, if we have a valid name, we want to hide the red X, but also if the user state does not exist. So again, if the field is empty, we also want to hide that red X. Otherwise, we'll display it by applying the class name invalid. So after we've made these changes and saved all of this, let's look at our form and see how this works. I'll expand, and I'm going to go ahead and show the console as well. I'll clear out what we've currently got in there. And now I've got focus on the username. Notice the instructions are not displaying, and we do not have a green check or a red X because we don't want that to happen when the form loads. We want our form to look just like this, very nice and clean. But as soon as I type a letter, now we get the directions because the user state exists. And there's our Font Awesome icon, that's the info circle. And we have the red X up here in the label as well. And we've got false and D in the console. And as soon as I type another letter, we get false and DA. So this will continue to display like this until we actually meet the requirements. And then when I get the fourth letter in there, it's now true, and this username is acceptable, and the directions have hid themselves, and we have a green check mark now. Likewise, if I delete everything in the field and we have an empty input, the directions are gone, and we do not have a green check or a red X, either one. So that is how our user input works. Okay, I'm going to close the dev tools and resize Chrome again. And I'm also going to resize Visual Studio Code and go ahead and press Control B to hide that file tree. We don't really need it. We're just working on this one component. So I'm going to scroll down now, and after our directions or our instructions for that username, I'm going to go ahead and add the password field by pasting everything in and just discussing the differences because it's very similar. I save and get the proper formatting. You can see we have a label that has the exact same logic as far as displaying the check or the red X. But now we're looking at the password state and valid password instead of the username. Now if I scroll up and look at the input, we have 8 attributes instead of 10. So first let's discuss the 2 that are missing. Autocomplete is missing because this is a type password and it will not support the autocomplete setting anyway. So that is not there. We also don't have a reference because we do not want to set the focus on this field when the component loads. Otherwise, we have the same attributes. So type is not text, it's password. We have an ID of password that matches the ID here in the label of password. The onChange, once again, ties this to state, and now we're setting the password state. It is a required field. We have an ARIA invalid attribute, and it also has a ternary statement in there looking at the valid password. We have an ARIA described by, and that's looking for the ID password note. And we again have on focus and on blur to see if we are in that field or not. Now let's look at this password that describes the directions for the password field with ARIA described by, because it's just a little more complicated. Once again, we're looking to see if there's focus on the field, but we don't have to see if a password exists because we want it to display as soon as there is focus on this field. It will not display at load time because we do not set the focus. Then we also look to make sure there is not already a valid password. If there is a valid password, we want to hide those instructions. In the directions, we once again have the font awesome icon with the info circle, and we have our directions here that are clearly spelled out. But when we get to listing the allowed special characters, notice what we have to do. We put each one in a span, and we use the ARIA label attribute so the screen reader can read the description of each special character. Okay, with those changes made and saved, now let's go back and look at our example again and look at the password field. I'm going to press Control, Shift, and I to open the DevTools, clear out what we have in the console, and now when I put the focus on the password, we instantly get the directions. And we see those directions there. I can type an exclamation mark. And now, of course, we have the red X now that we started typing characters because it doesn't work. We don't want the red X while it's empty. But if I type an exclamation mark, capital letter, lowercase letter, and now 5 digits, one more. There we go. And now it meets the requirements. And we get a green check, and the instructions have hidden themselves. But if we go ahead and delete one, we once again get the instructions and the red X. So this is also working as expected, and we can see the true and the password that has been entered over here in the console. Okay, well, once again, close DevTools, resize Chrome, resize Visual Studio Code, and give a little space underneath that last description and paste in what we have for the matching confirmation of the password. I'll save again to get the auto formatting, and as we see, the label has confirmed password, and once again, the same logic for the font awesome icons. And I say same logic, but there is a slight difference. Before, we were just looking for a valid match, but really here, the matching password must have something in it, because if we just left it blank and it could be a valid match, it would show the green check when both fields were empty. So you have to have not only a valid match, but the matching password state does need to exist. Now when we come to showing the red X, it is the same logic as before. If we scroll up and look at the input, we have the same 8 attributes as the password field, but this is the confirm password, and this ID once again matches the HTML4 attribute of the label. And then ARIA described by points to the confirm note, and here we're looking at valid match instead of valid password in the ARIA invalid attribute. The confirm note ID points to the description, and it is much simpler than the password because we really don't need to check everything that we checked the password for. We're already doing that validation there. All we're doing as far as the validation of this field is making sure they match. So our description just says they must match the first password input field. Also remember that in our useEffect, we're looking at the state of both of these fields, password and match password. So now let's look at the example and see how it responds because of that. So I'll resize Visual Studio Code, resize Chrome, once again open up DevTools, clear out the console, and now in confirm password, once it gets focused, we see the instructions. Start typing the password, and here I'm logging the password from the password field in the DevTools instead of the confirm password. So we're just waiting until this matches. We'll probably see true over here the whole time. And once it matches, the instructions are hidden and we do not have a red X. And if I delete one character, then we get the red X and the instructions come back. But now watch what happens if I delete a character from the password field. Now it's false, and we do not have a password that matches the validation here, but notice confirm password also responded to that because it now shows a red X because it does not match the password field. If we go ahead and add that character back, then they both change back to green. So confirm password will always respond to changes in password as well. Okay, closing DevTools, resizing Chrome, resizing Visual Studio Code again. I'm going to scroll to the bottom of the form because we're not quite finished. We have 3 inputs, but we have no way to submit that information. So we really need a submit button. but we don't have to provide type equals submit. When there's only one button in a form, that's what it is by default. So the only attribute that we need to provide is disabled. And I want to keep that disabled until we have validated all the fields. So if we do not have a valid name, or we do not have a valid password, or we do not have a valid match, then disabled is true. Otherwise, it's false. And then we can see we just put the text sign up on the button. So I'll save that, and if we go back, we don't really need to expand everything, but we can see as soon as one field is invalid, not only do we get the instructions, but the sign up button is disabled. All three must be valid in order for the sign up button to be enabled. Okay, while we're at the bottom of the form, and as far as that goes, the bottom of the component here in Visual Studio Code, notice we have the already registered and sign in link here, and we'll put that below the form, and it's just a paragraph, but I also put a note in because if we expanded this in a full application, this would be a React router link. This is just a placeholder link. So right now, if you launch this application or this project with just this placeholder link in here, React will give you a warning in the terminal because of it, because this isn't really an actual link that you would need to have. So we would put a React router link here to link back to another part of the application with the sign-in form. Okay, we don't currently have a function that submits our form yet, so I'm going to expand Visual Studio Code. We need to scroll back up to our form element where it begins here on our form. And let's go ahead and add the onSubmit event, because remember, with only one button, we don't need to put an onClick on that button. It creates a submit event for the form because it's the only button in the form. And so here we'll just put handleSubmit, and then we'll need to create this function above. So let's scroll on up here just underneath this last useEffect, and we'll define handleSubmit. Set it equal to a function. It's going to be an async function. And inside here with the event that it will get by default, you don't need to pass the event here in the onSubmit for the form. We'll just say e.prevent default and save. Now the first thing to consider in this function that we're creating for submission is the only thing preventing or really enforcing our regex validation is that submit button, and that could actually be hacked if somebody knew JavaScript. They could just go into the console, grab that button through a selection, and enable it. And so if you want to be very cautious, of course 99% of people wouldn't do that, maybe even 99.9%, but you could put in something that looks a lot like this. And here we're just going to validate the information in the state of the user and the password again. So if for some reason the button was enabled and it allowed somebody to submit the state that wasn't passing anyway, wasn't passing our validation checks, we're just checking those again. And if either one of those are false, we're setting the error message to invalid entry. Of course, they would know which one was an invalid entry because our validation would be showing that on the form. And then we're just returning, so we don't submit anything to our back end that would have the database where we would actually save a user with invalid information. Okay, so this could be the point in the tutorial where if you haven't created a back end to submit this form to, and you could do that with my full Node.js course, and that's actually what I'm going to validate this information against, is the REST API that is created in that Node.js course. So I'll give a link to that below. But if you haven't done that, this could be where you want to stop, and you might just want to console log the user state and the password state, and then you might set the success and just set it to true right here. And then we could do something with the JSX to show a successful message. But here I'm going to come back to this and actually use Axios to submit to a back end that we've created in that Node.js course. And that will allow us to get some different user responses, or API responses, I should say, and display user messages as far as success or error messages if we get an incorrect response from the API. So if you are not going to go ahead and create that backend as well to check this against, let's go ahead and display something for the success first. So down here in the JSX, I'm going to scroll. We'll start with a fragment. And there we've got a closing fragment, which I'll add at the end. We won't use right now. So just a fragment. There, I got it again. 2, 3. There we go. And now here I'm going to paste the beginning of a ternary statement. So we're going to check to see if we have success state. And if we do, this would be the ternary here to show true, we'll display this section instead that says success. It has another placeholder link that should be turned into a React router link that would link to the sign in once again. And then if it's false, we'll display this section we've created with our registration form. So at the very end, I need to go ahead and close out this ternary, and then I need to provide that closing fragment. So we'll scroll all the way down to add that to our page. Okay, I believe we're at the right spot. We can close out the ternary, and I need to add a curly brace for the statement. And I think that's good. Let's see. Oh, we need the closing fragment too. There we go. Now we should be good. We'll save and get better formatting there. And now we'll go ahead and try submitting a form, and we'll have to launch this application that we've created instead of the example one. But if we submit that form, I'll scroll back to where we are in the code here. Here we are with the handleSubmit. It should just go ahead and log the user and password to the console, set success to true, and then we should see this section instead of our registration form. Okay, I'm opening up a terminal and going to type npm start to go ahead and launch the application that we've created. Okay, the application we've created has launched. I'm going to expand Chrome. I'm going to open up DevTools as well. Go ahead and clear out anything we have there. And we'll need to enter in valid input so we can submit the form. Three valid inputs. The sign up button is now enabled. I'm going to press enter, and we got our success because the success state is now true, and there is our placeholder link that should go back to the sign in page. And over here in the console, we now logged the username and the password that would be submitted to a backend. Now that we know our test application is working, let's go ahead and resize and go back to the code. And in Visual Studio Code, I'm going to stop the application because we need to install one more dependency. And this dependency is Axios. As you can see, I'm typing in the terminal npm I Axios. So I'll press enter, and as soon as that installs, I'll come back to the tutorial. Okay, Axios is completed installing. I'll close the terminal, and then I'm going to show the file tree. We can check the package.json to make sure Axios is there, and there it is. So I'll close the package.json file. Now inside the source folder, I want to create another folder. I'm going to name this API. And then inside the API folder, I'm going to create a new file, and I'm just going to name it axios.js. Inside the Axios file, I'm going to paste this in, but I'm importing Axios from Axios. From there, I can say export default axios.create and set a base URL. And this allows me to set the base URL for the full application, so I don't have to continue to retype this elsewhere, because we'll import Axios from this file into the other components that we would use. So here I've got HTTP localhost 3500, and that's because I'm going to run my development backend from my Node.js course in another instance of Visual Studio Code, and it's going to be at port 3500. Okay, with this complete, let's save that file. We can close it out. We'll go back to register, and we need to go all the way to the top because now we'll need to import Axios from that file. So let's do that here. We'll type import Axios from, and that'll be ./API/Axios. There we go. And we can save right there. And now let's scroll back down to our handleSubmit function where we will use Axios. I'm going to remove the console log and the set success for now because what we really want here is a try catch block. So there's our try, and now we'll have a catch that could have a possible error. Inside the try block, we're going to define a response that we should get from Axios. So we'll set the response equal to await Axios.post. Now remember, our handleSubmit is an async function, so we can use await inside of that. Now inside the post for Axios, we need to provide a register URL. And so let's define that. We have our base URL, but let's go ahead and provide the register URL, and let's set that with a constant up here at the top near where we had our regex statements. So we'll say const register_URL, we're just going to set this equal to /register, which would be the endpoint for our registration in our backend API. Now we can scroll back down, and inside this handleSubmit function, let's go ahead and provide our register_URL. After that, we need to provide the payload, essentially the data we're sending. So it's json.stringify. And inside here, I'm going to destructure two objects, really. We've got user and password. I said objects, two properties. But if this is because our backend, by the way, is expecting a property named user and a property named pwd for password. If we had named our state username, we would have to do this because the backend is still expecting a user property and not a username property. But since they have the same name, we can just say user. Likewise, for password, if we had named it password, maybe we would be like this. But since it has the same name as the property that the backend will be looking for, we can just put it in like that and it will be destructured on the back end. Okay, a third parameter now needs to be added to post. And so here, this is an object. And inside this object, we need to specify headers, and headers has its own object. So here we'll say content-type. We'll set this to application/JSON. And now after headers, we provide a comma. And we also need to say with credentials and set that to true. No comma needed there as we finished the object. And now I'll actually add a return here so we know we're finished with the await Axios post. I enjoy using Axios instead of fetch because we don't have to manually change the response to JSON. It already happens. So here we could just look for the data that we'll get back from Axios, and that is response.data. It's saved in the data property, so that would be the response from the server. But if we were looking for something else, it could also be in there. And for example, in the backend that we created in my Node.js course, we get an access token back. So we could log that. Or if you want to look at the full response object, you just need to use JSON stringify so you don't get object in the console. And there you can pass in the response that you want to see as well. I'm going to scroll up just a little bit, but this would be our point to go ahead and set the success to true so we can see our success page in this tutorial. This would also be a good place, and I'll just note this here with a comment, to clear the input fields out of the registration field if you wanted to. So this would be where I do that, and of course you would just set the state back to empty strings. Now you could use your own logic as far as a conditional in the error block, but I'll put in a few standard ones that you might expect to get. So the first one will start with an if statement, and basically we'll have if no error response, and we'll use optional chaining because that means we haven't heard from the server at all. Maybe we've lost our internet connection. Then we can have a set error message, and we can put in no server response. But then we could provide an else if, and of course you could use a lookup object here, a switch statement, any other type of conditional logic you want to. I'm just using an if statement right now. And now we've got error response. We don't need optional chaining because it won't make it here if we don't have a response there. It would say the no server response. But now we can use optional chaining on the response and check the status. Of course, it likely exists. But if we get a status 409, that means the username that we've tried to submit is already taken. So we can say error message once again, and we'll just say username taken. And finally, another else we might provide here is just a generic error. So we could say set error message, and we'll just say registration failed. Once again, these error messages I don't feel like need to point to any one specific field other than the username taken, because we already highlight the validation as the form is filled out. Finally, after the conditional logic here for the errors and what message we want to display, you want to set the focus on that error field for screen readers and save. Okay, with our registration form complete, including using Axios, we are ready to test it out with our development backend. And what I want to point out is if you do have this from my Node.js course, you will need to add localhost port 3000 that the React application is running on into the allowed origins, or CORS will not let you access this backend because we did put in those security checks. Okay, now we can type npm run dev for this backend instance, and it will launch the Node.js server, which will be ready then and listening for our submissions from our registration form. Okay, we're connected to Mongo. Server is running on port 3500. Okay, we're ready to test our application. So the first thing I'm going to do is type in my name, same password I've been using, press enter, and we get a username taken because I had already reserved that username. So now let's go ahead and try something else. Let's look at our React code. And in our React code, let's just make a quick change that we know will create a failure. So if we scroll all the way up and look at our register URL, let's just remove an R there so it doesn't contact it correctly. And let's see what happens when that occurs. So now I'm going to go ahead and resubmit and see what error we get. Registration failed. Well, that's great too. So we got a response, but it just didn't work out. Now let's go back to the code and of course fix our endpoint. So we'll need to add the R back. And let me try to think of a name I haven't already used. And here we can go Dave, Dave. That'll work. And I will submit. And we got success with the sign-in. So we've checked everything except not having a connection. So now I'm going to stop the Node server over here on my other screen. Looks like I'll need to reload. And we could type in just about anything because we're not going to have a connection, but the form has to be able to submit. So we need valid name and password at least. Oops, I didn't get a valid password confirmation at the end. There we go, and submit. And now we have to wait for it to time out before we get the error, but we got a no server response error. Everything is working as expected. I hope this tutorial has helped you learn how to not only create a form with custom validation in React, but has also shown you how important that it is to have accessibility features throughout. And to highlight that fact before we finish, I'm going to go ahead and turn on Chrome Vox, which is an extension you can add to Chrome. If you search the Google Chrome store for that, it's free. I'll turn on the screen reader.
App. Username. Edit text invalid input. 4 to 24 characters. Must begin with a letter. Letters. Numbers. Underscores. Hyphens allowed. D. A. V. E. Password. Password edit text invalid input. 8 to 24 characters. Must include uppercase and lowercase letters. A number and a special character. Allowed special characters exclamation mark at symbol hashtag $%. Alert. Dot. 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 Confirm password. Password edit text invalid input. Must match the first password input field. Dot. 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 Sign up. Sign up. Button. No server response.
So it even announced our error message. That is great. One other thing we can look at are the elements in the console. And let me inspect the username input. Notice the aria invalid attribute, I'll drag this over, is false because we have a valid name. As soon as I change this though, aria invalid is true. So it is also responding to what we do in that field. And all of these things are needed for form accessibility. Again, if you like the pace of this tutorial where I didn't type out every little individual digit, please like and let me know in the comments below so I'll know to make more tutorials like this. And I'll also give a link to that Node.js course, so if you haven't already created a backend that could interact with this React form, you'll learn how to in that course. Remember to keep striving for progress over perfection, and a little progress every day will go a very long way. Please give this video a like if it's helped you, and thank you for watching and subscribing. You're helping my channel grow. Have a great day, and let's write more code together very soon.